From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Welcome to this week's Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, and advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. This episode of the podcast is special in several ways. First of all, this episode marks the completion of the first year of the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. We believe we've been successful in that goal of increasing awareness because my awareness as a person has increased, as in many cases has the awareness even of the guests. We've learned from each other, and we're going to continue to do that today. This episode is being released during the final week of National Safety Month, which is focused on hazard recognition. And over the past year, I've become more convinced that the knowledge, skill, and ability to recognize psychosocial hazards is a bit lacking here in the U.S. There is an international standard, ISO 45003, that gives guidance relative to psychological health and safety at work. It was developed by the International Organization for Standardization, and it was intended to help organizations understand and manage psychosocial risks more effectively. And there are actually 30 other countries who've taken this to heart. They have their own individual standards in those countries. They have some legislation in place, but the U.S., not so much. So, and often when I'm doing the podcast, I find myself almost having to educate and inform people about what I'm talking about when I talk about psychosocial risks and psychosocial hazards and psychological health and safety, but that's not the gig today. So I'm fortunate to have three folks that I've met varying levels of time that have background, and they understand not only this standard, but they understand the concept of psychological health and safety, psychosocial risk assessment. They're kind of into that. So excuse us if we nerd out just a bit for the next hour or so. And we're going to get right into it because I just can't wait. And I'm going to ask this somewhat patented. It's not totally patented. Other people have probably done it. This question that I ask guests as they come on. And my first guest has been here before, but I'm going to ask her again, who is Kahlilah Guyah?
Kahlilah Guyah, that's me. You know, there's three other folks on the line here today. So I'm the CEO and principal consultant at EHS Compliance Services, and we help organizations protect workers, the environment, and corporate reputation. And we do that through 5 service pillars: development of EHS strategy, conducting risk assessments, conducting compliance and management system audits. And that's kind of where the ISO 45003 guidance document falls into place. We provide innovative learning and development solutions, as well as EHS program development. And we service our clients through our core values of integrity, excellence, value, and collaboration. So I'm so excited to be here today to collaborate with other experts in psychosocial risk management and psychological health and safety. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So a new guest to the podcast that I met recently. So who is Ken Clayman?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Yes, my name is Ken Clayman. I currently work for Booz Allen Hamilton, a management consultancy based out of the Washington, D.C. area. But I've been doing environmental health, safety, and quality management work for close to 40 years. So it's been a while. I've been doing management systems in particular for well over 20 years. I haven't even counted the exact number at this point. But I am also involved with the development of the occupational health and safety management system standards through our U.S. Technical Advisory Group, of which I'm currently the chairman, and also as a delegate to the International Organization for Standardization Technical Committee 283, which created ISO 45001 and ISO 45003 and a few other documents besides. And regarding ISO 45003, I was the lead U.S. delegate for the development of that standard. And so I've been getting educated through various means on psychological health and safety in the workplace, on psychosocial risk management, and so forth. And it's been a interesting and wonderful journey so far, and I've got a long ways to go, and I'm glad to be working and talking with all of you.
Right on, right on. And again, another returning guest, who is Dr. Allessandria Polizzi.
Well, thanks for having me back. I guess I didn't ruin it the first time. So my name is Dr. Allessandria Polizzi. I am currently the CEO of a company called Verdant Consulting. We focus on workplace mental health and implementing the ISO 45003 as well as the World Health Organization's guidelines for workplace mental health. I'm a former HR executive. I spent 20 plus years in leadership and organizational development. So I come at this from a slightly different perspective, which is about the human-centric workplace and driving performance through people. And so my company focuses on the development of those skills and capabilities, as well as the competency to assess hazards and mitigate risk.
Wow. Well, okay, that wraps it up. We're just skimming the surface here. I would, so thanks very much for either introducing Kenyon, you're introducing yourself, and Kahlilah and Al. That's what friends call Dr. Al. Let's call her Al. So how did you all get introduced to the standard itself? Again, I'll share my, again, stumbling across it was I was actually just completing my literature review for my dissertation, to be quite honest. And somebody, I don't know, I heard there was a standard out there, and I started kind of pecking around and found it. And I went like, wow, this seems to really have some value. But I again, it is all self-learned, self-taught. And so I want to find out how you all, how you got involved early on with the standard, how you found out about it, and that type of thing. So why don't we start with Ken, and then we'll go Kahlilah, and then Al. Go ahead, Ken.
Sounds good. Well, as I kind of mentioned in my introduction there, I got involved or found out about the standard by being involved with TC 283. Way back in 2013, TC 283 was formed as a project committee, and their first task was the development of ISO 45001, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Management System standard that has been out since 2018. In the latter part of 2018, the project committee converted to a technical committee. In the ISO world, what that means is they could work on more than just one document, whereas a project committee can only work on a singular document. And the first document that the group that the new TC decided to work on became ISO 45003. It was a proposal brought forward by our Canadian friends who have a national standard on occupational health and safety, psychosocial risk management, as do many others in the British Commonwealth. And so this was accepted as a work activity. And our U.S. Technical Advisory Group, at the time chaired by others, asked me to take the lead for our delegation on the standards development. And that's how I came to the standard. In 2018, we started working on it in our first meeting in England, and it took us about 3.5, 4 years to get it all done. And in 2021, we released the new standard.
Absolutely. Kahlilah, what about you?
Well, I was a part of the TC 283 as well. And I came in a little later on than Ken did. I really focused on the 45,003 work group. But prior to that, I was and still am a lead auditor for OSAS 18,000, which came before ISO 45,001. And so when that transition occurred, there was this piece in the standard about psychosocial risks, that we're looking at risks that are not just of a physical nature to the workplace and the worker, but also of a psychological nature. Well, as a traditional EHS professional and consultant, I'm like, well, what does that mean? How do we do this? And so, having several friends and some folks on our team who are in the mental health space, they began to educate me about psychosocial risks. And then we started to look at our risk assessment process and start to include some of those psychosocial factors in it. And the good news was that the ISO 45003 guidance document was on the way a few years later. And so then that gave us a framework to not only look at risk from a psychosocial perspective, but also to include it in our auditing that we do of organizations that want to be certified to the ISO 45001 standard, and also those that say we want to use that as a framework, but we don't necessarily want to move forward with certification. So that's how I found out about it and how we continue to include it in the work that we do.
Okay. Al, how about you?
So one, I love hearing about how this work started well before COVID, because that's a common comment I get. So happy to hear that and share that. So I came out about this completely differently. So I was on my own kind of personal journey of having just burned out as a head of HR, as an executive, unable to find anything that would help me based on science. Everything seemed like, Bob's blog on how I recovered from burnout, or yoga retreats. And so I just was like, I need something that's going to give me hard facts and skills. And so I started doing research via my daughter's school library and just started reading article after article after article. Got me very curious, more and more curious about the fact that all these things have been well documented. We know exactly what can cause these harm, mental health harm, or what tactics can be applied to help navigate difficult situations at work. And none of these have ever existed in any of the training that I've been privy to, and in my 20 plus years. And so I felt like, well, someone needs to tell somebody. I guess it'll be me. And so I started to just learn more and more. And network with people, and I met a veterinarian actually who is very passionate about this area, and he worked with a gentleman out of Australia who Jason Von Shee, who I had on my podcast, and they showed me this 45,003, which had literally just been published. This was July 2021, and to me, this was a game changer. This took workplace mental health from squishy, nice to have, like scary things, all the things that have come up for people as we talk about being human at work, and puts it in a rigorous way that we can measure, that we can follow as a framework, etc. And so to me, it just completely transitioned the ability to have this conversation in a way that was less messy and more able to be seen as a serious business decision.
Absolutely. Wow. So everybody comes to this from a very different yet similar perspective, because it sounds like there was an interest in the topic, and then the standard just helped kind of foster the interest. And there's also a commonality here that, at least that I hear, is that we kind of found out about this. And I'll be honest, I actually learned as much about this from somebody in the UK and then another person in Canada before I met anybody in the US, which is why this conversation for me is just so exciting to have some folks. And again, I've only had 2 or 3 folks on the podcast that aren't from the US. And I don't do that to be protectionist. I do that so folks in the U.S. won't say, well, it's easy for them to talk about this from whatever their country is. So this will help me convince some folks in the U.S. that, yeah, there are people here who get it as well. But let's talk a little bit about the fact that we've got 30 other countries around the world. We've got the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization. There's the UN, all these folks talking about this. And we still seem to have difficulty getting the conversation started in some corners of the U.S.
Not corners, the vast majority, my friend.
I'm glad, Al, I'm glad you jumped in on that, because I want to get your perspective on that. So Al, and then Ken, and then Kahlilah, why do you think it is that way? What's your thought about why it's that way?
I think the old guard has a problem letting go. That's just simply put. And if I had to do it this way, I don't understand why nobody else has to do it this way. And so I think it's interesting. About a week and a half ago, I was presenting to 50 other fellow chief people officers, right? And I was talking about burnout within the HR function, which also took us to a conversation on workplace mental health. And one of the CPOs got on and was arguing with me about how, well, that's how you drive innovation, is by narcissistic behavior. His words. No, the data does not actually demonstrate that to be true, but we've convinced ourselves of this whole, you have to break eggs to make omelets. Like, you have to beat people around. Like, maybe that works every once in a while. And I know we have some examples where that is true, but that the vast majority by far. And if you ask yourself, when have I done my best work? It has not been in a psychologically unhealthy workplace. So I think we just have a mental model that we have to change. And, people have a hard time letting go.
Ken, what about you? What do you think?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to give too much of a different answer than Al just did, but to me, it's a cultural thing, right? I am, full disclosure, I'm in my early 60s. So I've been around for a little while and grew up in the era where you didn't talk about mental issues or mental health. You didn't acknowledge that it happened. Those were just the crazies, right? The crazy people. Whether it was work related or outside of work, it didn't matter. You just didn't deal with it. And I think there's a lot of that cultural bias still strongly in existence. And to Al's point, the old guard in particular aren't letting go of that cultural bias, because to them, they're still the crazies. There's nothing really wrong with them if they just got themselves together, right? If they just stood up straight and flew like the rest of us. But I think a lot of it comes down to that. It's culturally, embedded. And then we haven't seen that turnover generationally yet to those who understand it, or at least accept it more readily than those of older generations. I think the younger generations do accept the fact that we are of mind and body, not just body, and that both of those things need to be taken care of in some manner along the way, and particularly in our work environments, because that's where we spend most of our time.
Right.
As adult human beings, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that cultural aspect of it has translated itself to the legislative aspect in the U.S., in that our legislators, look at the average age of our legislators, particularly at the federal level, don't want to deal with it because of that cultural bias too. They don't recognize it. And so it's interesting. I've been reading a book, you may have heard about it, from Ellen Pincos Cobb. All right, I can even give her a little push here. I've been reading this book, and among her first things that she indicates is that the U.S. is the only industrial nation, only developed nation that does not have any federal legislation regarding mental aspects of worker health and safety.
Yes.
And she goes on to prove it through different things. And to some of us, it was kind of apparent regardless. but she puts a lot of good research in there to show how that's the case.
Yes.
So I'll hand it over to Kahlilah.
Well, yeah, I did want to just a little bit of a plug. So I'm actually going to look back in the record. But so Ellen was one of our guests. I actually met her through a group called the Workplace Bullying Institute. So for those who are listening, want to go back and listen to her comments. She's got something. That's actually where I get that number about 30 countries. It's actually from her book. Kahlilah, your thoughts about why we are where we are.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo some of the things that both Al and Ken have said. So I think many countries that we model, our ISO standard after, like Canada, right? They're the ones that had the standard back in 2013. Many countries have a risk-based approach to environmental health and safety and worker well-being. As Ken alluded to, here in the States, it is compliance focused, right? And so what we know about compliance is it's not bad, but it definitely does not mean that you have identified and assessed and mitigated the risks that exist in your organization. And so because a lot of countries are looking at risks, they naturally include risk to not only physical health, but also psychological health, which is not something that we do here in the US. So we don't have regulations. And in addition to not having regulations, we don't, generally speaking, have a risk-based approach from a regulatory framework standpoint. And so there's not a driver for it from any aspect outside of the fact that organizations want to identify all risks. So if an organization has a more mature EHS program, environmental health and safety, EHS, then they'll be looking at psychosocial risk because they're looking more at risk-based assessments as opposed to compliance-driven assessments. And so I think that that tackles some of the things that Ken was talking about. Now, there is hope because California, Connecticut, Maryland, New Jersey, my home state, all have requirements for workplace violence prevention policies, right? So we're getting there, but that's just one piece of psychosocial factors. And actually the policies are not requiring workplaces to identify the factors, the psychosocial factors that may drive workplace violence situations. So it's only partly addressing the problem. And then the second thing that, Al alluded to, and I think Ken did as well, is the stigma. There is a significant stigma here in the States around mental health. In addition to the stigma that is associated with mental illness in particular, there are cultural nuances across different demographics. Now, I'll speak for the African American population because, look at me. That's me. That's my population. Generally speaking, we are a little bit more adverse. It's a little bit more taboo in our culture and our demographic to address mental health concerns, whether that's speaking about it or obtaining mental health services, going to therapy. I think that's shifting, but there is some cultural nuance, some cultural taboo around that. And there are other demographics within the United States and across the world, though, but since we're focusing on the US, that are really adverse to interactions related to mental health or mental illness. And so we've got to overcome that in addition to the overall stigma that exists. And then the last thing I'll say is that because of the stigma, I think it makes it really difficult for organizations to address it. So there are not a lot of tools that are available. I know that there are some, and our team is working with some software developers to develop an actual tool, but we have a process that we walk our organizations through. It's called 5I, Psychological Health and Safety, to help them identify and mitigate and control psychosocial factors that exist in the workplace. So because of that stigma, there's not a lot of resources. I think we're getting there. Right. But a lot of the resources that we have are from Australia or Canada or some other countries, which may not necessarily speak to how things are done here in the US. So I think there are a number of ways or reasons that we're a little behind on this.
Wow.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, please
Am
do.
I-
Sure.
Two things that came up for me. Thank you so much for that, Kahlilah. And so, there are organizations like Kahlilah's, like mine, others. I'm sure, David, you offer services as well. But what I see is it's kind of a little bit of the Wild West where people are creating material with very little. I mean, I see a lot of people talking about psychological safety, which has nothing to do with psychological safety. And then, so that's one. And then two, it's interesting you talked about the risk versus compliance. The thing about mental health is that mental health is often perceived as a benefit, not a requirement for our employees. In other words, that's personal, and not the business of the employer. And so it's been very separated as far as what we can and cannot talk about. So if I think about, how we were 50 years ago about the physical health of our employees, where we probably weren't going to ask people to track how many steps they took or how much water they drank or how much they slept. Our mindset has changed on that. I feel like that's kind of where we are when it comes to mental health, which we all have. If you have the brain, the gift with purchase is all the other stuff. So I think that's where we can really start to change that approach of thinking about this as a benefit for people who are ill versus a way to keep our workforce healthy and productive.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Yes, absolutely. So we a lot, again, to all of your points, particularly, to Kahlilah's last one about we have a society that's really, really jazzed up about lagging indicators of everything. Literally, I didn't realize it when I started, Ken, when I started 42 years ago in the fire rescue service. I didn't realize I was going into an entire system that is lagging indicator designed. The entire thing's set up to roll a bunch of people. And so, a bit of a nerd out for me. The United States spends $320 billion on fire protection in this country to solve a $14 billion problem. That's a whole nother conversation for another day because it's totally lagging indicator designed. How do we have people so when you call them and say your house is on fire, they're going to show up with a bunch of trucks and squirt a bunch of water around and break a bunch of stuff and then go back to their fire station, when we should be in that endeavor and virtually all others, we should be, clearly to your point, more risk-based. Where is the risk? How do we identify the risk, assess the severity of the risk, mitigate the risk before we end up having to spend a bunch of money, get a bunch of people injured and killed after the fact? So if you were to looking at just the organizational landscape or we do have folks out there who are starting to get it, but what do you think is the most significant threat to those who don't? So the people out there who think this isn't an issue, that's not that big of a deal, what do you think is the biggest threat to them? So Kahlilah, we'll start with you on that one.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I think the obvious threat is that if we fail to address psychological health and safety, then we continue to negatively impact worker health and well-being, both mentally and physically. But even more than that, for organizations to thrive, and if they want to thrive and not just survive, if that, and they want to be around for the long term, addressing psychosocial factors is crucial. And here's why. We know that in the next 7 years, so by 2030, which is crazy to think that that's only 7 years away, but millennials and Gen Z will represent over 70%, according to some data out there, of the workforce, right? And these are generations that are like, look, you need to create an environment that supports my mental well-being. So if organizations want to attract and retain top talent, then they are going to have to address psychosocial factors in the workplace. And I think if they don't, then they may fail to exist or will be struggling to maintain talent that's going to support the work that they need to get done.
Wow. Ken, what are your thoughts? The significant risk out there to those who go, this is
Same
just a
as
bunch of...
hers.
Okay.
Same as Kahlilah.
Yeah.
No, see, I'm serious. Just a couple things. I want to take just a little bit of a step back, sort of to our last topic, but I'll come back around to this as well. A couple things I want to point out with ISO 45003. First of all, the intent of this guidance standard, and I'm using that terminology very deliberately, is that it is supposed to be used in conjunction with an occupational health and safety management system that is based on ISO 45001 or something similar. As in the US, we have ANSI Z10, which is a very similar standard to ISO 45001. Having said that, we understood when we were developing the standard that many organizations would see that and use it in a standalone capacity. But where that could lead them astray is not fully getting the broader picture that 45001 engenders, and in particular, going to Kahlilah's earlier point about the risk-based approach. Because that's what 45001 really focuses in on, among other things. But it's understanding your hazards, your risks, your opportunities, doing an evaluation of what those are, and then determining what you need to manage them adequately and effectively. And within that context, ISO 45003 was written to supplement and complement those requirements so that organizations don't look just at the physical safety and health issues, because that's been our norm, but that they also do look at the mental, the cognitive, the well-being aspects of a total human being in the workplace. And so that's real important that we understand, and that our audience, hears the fact that, yes, go ahead and look at 45003, use it for what it's worth, but understand that it's meant to be part of a whole.
Right.
And that's very important to the point you're trying to make here is like, what else can we do? What's going to be the issue if we don't address this?
Okay.
And I in that regard, I agree 100+% with Kahlilah that the upcoming generations have a whole different outlook on life and how they can spend their time through their life. And that part of that is, okay, I know I got to work. I know I got to support myself and support my family, support my friends who are in many cases my family. But I need an organization that's going to take care of me as a human being all the way around, not just, coming in, do my job and go home, and maybe, talk about, we want to make sure that you're safe. So it's that total human being orientation that I think our younger generations have a better idea of than we did in, the older generations.
Al, your thoughts?
So obviously I echo Kahlilah and Ken. I will add number one, we know actually now research shows that 80% of employees would leave an organization for one with better mental health services and support. So this is already coming to fruition. But secondarily, in addition to the generational transition, actually the biggest threat or the biggest concern is climate change. That's the biggest threat to our mental health, according to WHO, Association Psychological, American Psychological Association, etc. That's not going away anytime soon, unfortunately, and that is going to continue to put weight on the mental health of our employees. So just as we worry about here in the U.S. about the obesity of our employees and trying to keep them healthy, we also have the environmental factor that will continue to put mental weight on our employees. And so, continuing to ignore the problem is not going to make it go away. And companies are going to start standing out as being focused on the whole person. And that's not just good for retaining employees. That's good for shareholders. That's good for outcomes. That's good for decreased customer service problems and increased quality, increased innovation, increased change. Anything that you're trying to accomplish in the business, be it retain the hard-won diverse talent that you've worked really hard to acquire, or to untap the brilliance of your team, you have to have the psychological safety in order to be able to make those things happen.
Wow. So wow. Oh boy. That's actually, it's actually exciting. I mean, it's exciting not only to know that there are folks like you all that have taken the time to kind of understand this, but that there is hope. And so let's pull on the hope thread there for a second. If you had a magic wand, let's say you had the, either the blinking from I Dream of Jeannie or the twitching of your nose from Bewitched. Now I'm dating myself by saying both of those. But if you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing that you would do to make a workplace psychologically healthy and safe for everybody who's there? What's the one thing that you would do? Ken, what about you? What that one thing you would do?
I'll focus in on here in the U.S. I think in that, taking that perspective, awareness, just having an organization with people at all levels have just a general awareness, or just any kind of awareness of this is a real thing, that people need to have that space that they can come to on a daily basis or work with on a daily basis, whether they're off-site or on-site, and know that they're in a good place and that they're not threatened by anything, that they can participate in a safe manner, that they can relate with people in general without fear of harm or other kinds of negative issues. That to me, I think if I had that magic wand, as you said, would be the one thing I'd want to see happen pervasively.
Okay. All right. Al, what's your thoughts? Your magic wand is out. What would you do?
I would have well-educated and well-skilled and adept leaders in every organization on this topic, and for a wide variety of reasons. Number one, according to Gallup, 70% of our managers are terrible. So we have a management problem. Being responsible for other people is a psychosocial hazard. So understanding my own needs, wants, desires, emotional well-being, so that I don't continue to perpetuate and create harm for those around me. So that's both self-care for leaders, but also the ability to create and craft organizations that support a psychologically healthy workplace. So to me, it's all really pinned on manager knowledge and capability.
Okay. All right. Kahlilah, what? Your magic wand. How would you wave it?
Wand. Okay. Okay. This is focused on psychosocial hazards, right? Not like getting my house cleaned magically. Right? If I would have the magic wand, I would want to, use it all over. But But for psychosocial safety and psychological health and safety, I think I would really try to provide some clarity around psychological health and safety and psychological safety, because I think right now there's a little bit of confusion, or even use terms interchangeably when we talk about psychological health and safety as it relates to developing a program that identifies psychosocial factors and risks and put strategies and methods and work environment shifts in place to reduce those risks, like some of the training and awareness that both Al and Ken mentioned, versus the management principle of having an environment of psychological safety, which is having an environment that allows people to speak up and without fear of retaliation. And all of that is critical in having psychological health and safety, but it is just one of the psychosocial factors. It is not all of them. And so I think providing some clarity on those terms and then helping organizations understand that there's something they could do today. They don't need to wait until they've got all 88 psychosocial factors figured out according to the guidance document ISO 45003, but they can do something today, and it doesn't have to be difficult and hard and weighty. It is something that experts are out there to assist with, and that they can make progress to reduce the psychosocial risks at their organization today.
Yeah, they're definitely out there. I've got 3 of them right here. So at the very least, so if you, so what are some signs to you? Again, pulling on the hopeful thread that things actually are changing. This isn't magic wand stuff, but what do you see going on out there right now that gives you hope, that says, look, we are at least heading in the right direction? Al, what are your thoughts?
Couple things. So my friend Susanna, she works with the WHO as part of ILO. She was actually I use her a lot. I use this clip from my podcast I did with her, where she talks about she basically describes this as an industrial revolution. That we are not going to be willing to go back. We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So we are not going to be willing to go back to these types of workplaces. And so I think seeing the publication of things like the WHO's workplace guidelines, or guidelines for workplace mental health, our own Surgeon General publishing right on the heels of that guidelines and framework for workplace mental health. I also see banks, Bank of America, Prudential, Aon, they're starting to implement a mental health index as part of their valuation of companies. This is starting to be seen as part of our risk analysis. So the conversation is starting to gain traction, which I think for those who are more forward thinking, more mature in their development and thought process around how we make businesses work, will embrace that and see that as our movement toward a better way of working.
Absolutely. Kahlilah, your thoughts. What are some signs that they're actually getting better?
Well, really, I really was going to highlight some of the things that Al highlighted. That U.S. Surgeon General framework is really something that talks about the prevention of harm. Like, protection from harm is that first pillar. And so that really integrates well with the ISO 45003 guidance document, that we have to identify what those factors are that are causing harm to organizations. So that definitely was a sign that, hey, it's not just out there in other countries, it is coming here to the US. In addition to that, the SEC is now looking at sustainability requirements that need to be included in annual reports. And sustainability for us now is not just about the environmental factor, but it's also about the social aspects of work. And those social aspects include psychosocial factors. They include health and safety. They include talent and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And so, to Al's point, organizations and investors and private equity funds are starting to look and say, do you have a system in place? Because it's going to get to the point where it's contingent upon whether we are going to invest in your organization and that will be privy to or hinged upon whether you have a way to manage psychosocial factors in your workplace.
Sure. Ken, your thoughts, signs that things are getting better.
Yeah, it's both of them. Those are hard to follow, and it's along the same lines that I was thinking as well. My addition to that is the bottom up factor.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that, and particularly again with the post-COVID world that we're now beginning to work in and with, I believe we have people, and again, I'm going to kind of generationalize it, the younger generation in particular, that are much more cognizant of themselves and their needs, and particularly of their mental health needs as they move through life. And they are demanding that the organizations that they work with and work for take that into account and do something about it in order to keep them as people that are going to work with them. And so while I do agree that we're seeing some of this top-down factor beginning to work, I think the bottom-up is a stronger element right now, and it's going to push that demand for greater emphasis on psychological health and safety than we've ever seen before.
Wow. Oh boy. Well, as I indicated when we first got started, we could do about 8 sessions and barely scratch the surface on this topic, but I won't do that because I want folks to come back and not feel like we talked at them for hours. But so as we conclude the conversation, I'd like each of you to kind of fill in something that you want to leave people thinking about this topic. Because so I know some they'll listen, they'll start the beginning, they'll start the end, they'll start in the middle. But for those who they kind of caught us about halfway through, and you want to leave them with something. What would you leave folks with that have been listening or watching us today?
Well, I think it comes down to the old saying about how you eat an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. And when it comes to taking care of issues like this, and I'm a systems person, I believe strongly in the management systems approach, and I do believe that people can use this to their complete benefit, that if they take the time to plan out what it is that they're dealing with, how they're going to deal with it, what are going to be the measures so that we know if we're dealing with it right, and how we're going to take actions to improve it, that whole plan, do, check, act model. I think if they take that kind of approach, and again, going back to Kahlilah's original point, risk-based, they understand those things and move in that direction deliberately along the lines of a plan and making adjustments along the way, they're going to find themselves in a very good place in a short amount of time.
Absolutely. Al, your thoughts?
Had to find the mute. So I guess what my it's hard to kind of put everything into one thought, but to sum up, what I would say is kind of what Ken's saying, which is change happens slowly and one step at a time. And so the best place to start is with educating yourself, which I think Kahlilah mentioned earlier, and becoming aware of the mindset that mental health is as important as physical health at work. And so just understanding that we are humans and not machines. So I just think that kind of just very practical, pragmatic approach to what's in our way and not being afraid if what's in our way is behavior, if what's in our way is, a system we bought that we thought we'd use that we don't use. Just talking about things openly so we can start removing those barriers, I think, is the best first step.
Absolutely. Kahlilah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combo of what Ken and Al have talked about, and change is slow. But I think what we can do is we can leverage systems we already have in place. And I think a lot of times when people look at psychological health and safety, or when they look at mental health, they start to panic a little bit, because it's like, oh my goodness, it's something else we got to do. It's another thing we got to do. And many times organizations already have systems that they can tap into, that are implemented in the workplace, that they can leverage to include psychological health and safety. So for organizations that are already doing job safety analyses, for organizations that are already doing risk assessments, it's a small tweak, but an important one to start to look at psychosocial factors. And maybe you don't include all of the ones that are identified in ISO 45003, because yes, that can be overwhelming, but maybe you look at the ones that are top of hearts and minds for your workforce, the ones that your workplace is most vulnerable to, Dr. Daniel, to use some vernacular from your dissertation, and start with those. So maybe it's 10, but hey, that's better than 0. And so just iteratively working towards improvement and integration into where you already are. So you don't have to take the entire standard and try to transform your workplace overnight. To Ken and Al's point, you can look at some psychosocial factors that are most important for your organization and start to integrate those into systems that you already have. And obviously, shameless plug, if you need help with that, I'm sure that any of us on the call would be happy to assist you.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Well, again, I'm really totally honored to have all three of you. I've learned a lot myself just sitting here listening to your expertise around the topic in general and around the standards specifically. I feel like I'm a few steps further down the road myself, and it's wonderful to know that none of us are on this road alone, that there are many of us. There's a growing community of people who are interested in the psychological health and safety of workers here in the United States, that we may be a little bit behind, but we can catch up quickly. And we can start catching up today. We don't have to wait till next week. We don't have to wait till there's something you can do today. So as I close out this episode of the podcast, I want to encourage each and every one of you who are watching us on the Flourish DX YouTube page. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you're listening to us wherever you get your podcast, I am encouraging you to do something with what you've heard, not only today, but what you've heard over the entire last year. This is not simply a passion project. This is an effort to see change. And a little change beats no change at all. And to all of the points of my guest today, I believe, honestly, that it is a matter of the survival of your organization. So human beings are going to be around. The question is, will your organization be around? And I believe that if you don't address this, I heard once that you may not like change, but you will not like irrelevance even more. So I want to have you be relevant. I want to have you grow. And again, we're all certainly happy. So you can reach out to any one of us. Certainly you can follow me in the podcast on LinkedIn or wherever you get an opportunity to connect with us. And I'm, again, just so thankful to my guest today, thankful to all who have watched and listened. And I'm encouraging you to come back next week, which will begin a new season of the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. And so we're looking forward to great things even in the coming year. So until next week, America, thanks very much, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to the Psych, Health, and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.